Some folks say there's nothing sadder than seeing a child cry over a parent who ain't coming back. Others might tell you that loneliness is the cruelest companion a man can keep in his later years. High in the Montana mountains, old Eli Cutter was about to discover both truths in one heartbreaking moment. For 15 years, he'd lived alone in these peaks, avoiding people and their complications. The wilderness was honest company. It never lied, never left, never broke your heart. But that October evening, as he walked his usual trail, Eli came upon a sight that stopped him cold. A gray wolf lay still beneath a fallen pine, and beside her a tiny pup whimpered and pawed at her lifeless body. The little one was trying to wake his mama, not understanding she was gone. What would this gruff old mountain man do with a helpless wolf pup? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dead wolf's body lay twisted beneath the fallen lodgepole pine, her silver-gray coat dulled by the gathering dusk. Eli Cutter stood motionless, his weathered hands gripping the hickory walking stick that had seen him through countless mountain trails. At 68, he'd thought himself past the kind of gut-punch sorrow that now threatened to buckle his knees. But there it was, washing over him like a cold mountain stream, the familiar ache of loss, sharp and unforgiving. The pup couldn't have been more than 8 weeks old. Its fur was the color of winter clouds, and its blue eyes held that particular brand of confusion that comes when the world suddenly stops making sense. The little creature kept nudging its mother's still form, letting out soft whines that carried on the October wind like prayers nobody was answering. Eli had been walking this same trail for the better part of 15 years, ever since he'd climbed up into these peaks, with nothing but a pack full of grief and a heart that felt like it had been carved hollow. The Bitterroot Range had become his sanctuary, a place where a man could disappear into the rhythm of seasons and weather, where silence wasn't something to fill but something to cherish. His cabin sat another 2 miles up the mountain, tucked into a grove of white-bark pine where the wind sang different songs depending on the season. It wasn't much to look at rough-hewn logs chinked with moss and clay, a stone chimney that drew clean, and windows that framed the kind of views most folks only saw on calendars. But it had been home longer than anywhere else had ever been, and it asked nothing of him except that he keep breathing. The worn leather journal in his coat pocket pressed against his ribs as he knelt beside the wolf. He'd carried that journal every day for 15 years, though he rarely opened it anymore. The pages held fragments of another life, pressed flowers Sarah had picked, sketches of birds she'd loved, words he'd written to her in those first raw months after she was gone. It had been their plan, this retreat to the mountains. They were going to build a little place up here when they got older, spend their golden years watching sunsets paint the peaks and listening to elk bugle in the autumn evenings. Cancer had other plans. Sarah Cutter had been the kind of woman who could gentle a spooked horse with her voice alone, who knew which wildflowers bloomed first after snowmelt and could read weather in the way clouds gathered over distant ridges. She'd been ranch-born, raised on the rolling grasslands east of Missoula, and she understood the language of land and animals the way some folks understood music. When the sickness came, it came fast and mean, stealing her strength first, then her voice, then the light in her green eyes that had guided Eli through 33 years of marriage. He'd tried staying on their little ranch after she passed, tried keeping up with the cattle and the hay crops, tried sitting in their kitchen without hearing her humming over morning coffee. But every familiar thing had become a reminder. Every sunset a mockery of beauty in a world that had gone grey and empty. So he'd sold off the livestock, leased the land to a neighbor, and packed what mattered into his truck. The mountains had always called to him, even when Sarah was alive. Now they were calling him home to die alone. That had been the plan, anyway. Live out his remaining years in honest solitude, tend a small garden, hunt when he needed meat, and let the seasons carry him toward whatever came next without the mess and heartbreak that seemed to follow human connection. He'd gotten good at it. this careful dance of survival without attachment. He knew every trail for 20 miles in any direction, could read weather signs and animal tracks, could find water in country that looked dry as old bones. He'd made himself useful to the wilderness in the way that mattered, taking only what he needed, leaving the rest undisturbed. The morning routine had become ritual. Up before dawn to tend the fire, coffee black and bitter, the way Sarah used to scold him for drinking it, then out to check his snares and gill nets. He'd always been handy with tools, had to be, growing up on hard-scrabble ranch land, where a man fixed what broke or did without. The cabin reflected that practical approach to living. Everything had a purpose, nothing wasted, every board and nail put where it would do the most good. Evenings were for reading. He had a small library of books Sarah had loved, stories about other places and other times that helped fill the silence between supper and sleep. Sometimes he'd play cards by lamplight, dealing out hands of gin rummy and playing both sides just to keep his mind sharp. He talked to himself now and then, the way isolated folks do, but he was careful not to make it a habit. There was a line between solitude and something darker, and he meant to stay on the right side of it. The wolf pup's cries grew weaker as full darkness settled over the mountainside. Eli could smell snow in the air. The first real storm of the season was coming, maybe tomorrow, maybe tonight. The little creature wouldn't last through a Montana blizzard, not alone, not this young. Hell, it might not last through the night, even with shelter. He'd seen death before, plenty of it. Cattle lost to harsh winters, horses that broke legs and had to be put down, the inevitable losses that came with ranch life. And Sarah, of course, he'd sat beside her bed in those final weeks, holding her hand while she slipped away by degrees. Death was part of the bargain, the price of loving anything in a world that gave and took according to its own harsh logic. But this felt different somehow. Maybe it was the way the pup kept trying to wake its mother, the stubborn hope in those blue eyes that refused to accept what had happened. Maybe it was the memory of Sarah's voice, heard clear as morning bells, across 15 years of silence. Every creature deserves a chance, Eli, even when the odds are stacked against them. The wedding ring on his finger caught what little light remained. He'd never taken it off, not once in all these years. Sarah had slipped it on his hand on a bright June morning in 1978, and it had become part of him, like a prayer, worn smooth by constant handling. Sometimes he caught himself turning it when he was thinking hard, the way other men might worry a lucky coin or scratch their beards. The mountains around them seemed to hold their breath, waiting. An owl called from somewhere in the dark timber, and the sound carried the weight of all the lonely evenings that stretched behind and ahead. Eli had thought himself past the point where life could surprise him, past the age when choices mattered beyond his own immediate comfort. He'd built his solitude carefully, like a stone wall, and it had served him well. Now here was this small life, crying for its mother in the gathering cold, and every instinct Sarah had taught him about mercy and responsibility was stirring to wakefulness. He could walk away. It would be the sensible thing, the safe thing. Nature would take its course, as it always did, and by morning there would be one less complication in his well-ordered existence. But he could also reach down and scoop up this bit of wildness, carry it home, and see what happened next. The thought terrified him more than he cared to admit. Caring for something meant risking loss, and he'd already lost more than any one man should have to bear. The pup looked up at him then, as if sensing his thoughts. Those blue eyes held no fear, only a kind of ancient wisdom that seemed older than its weeks on earth. It stopped crying and tilted its head, studying this strange, tall creature who smelled of wood, smoke and leather and old sorrows. Eli Cutter had spent 15 years learning how to live without hope. Now, in the space of a heartbeat, he felt that hard-won lesson slipping away like snow in spring sunshine. Against every bit of common sense he'd accumulated in nearly 7 decades on this earth, he found himself reaching down toward the small, grey form that sat watching him with eyes the color of mountain sky. The choice, when it came, felt less like a decision than a recognition of something that had already been decided by forces larger than his own careful plans. Some doors, once opened, changed everything that came after. And sometimes, if a man was lucky, those changes led not toward more loss, but toward a different kind of fullness he'd forgotten was possible. The first snowflakes began to fall as he gently lifted the wolf pup into his arms. The pup was lighter than Eli had expected, all fluff and bone beneath the downy fur. It didn't struggle as he cradled it against his wool coat, just pressed close to the warmth and let out a shuddering sigh that seemed too old for such a small creature. The snow was coming down harder now, fat flakes that caught in his beard and melted against the warmth of his cheeks. He'd made it maybe 50 yards up the trail before his resolve started to crack. This was foolishness, plain and simple. What did an old hermit know about raising a wolf pup? He had no milk, no proper shelter for a wild animal, no experience with anything more demanding than the occasional injured bird he'd doctored and released. The sensible thing would be to find a sheltered spot, make the little one as comfortable as possible, and let nature take its course. But when he stopped and looked down at the bundle in his arms, those blue eyes gazed back at him with such trust that it near broke his heart. The pup had stopped whimpering and was breathing in small, quick puffs that warmed the space between them. It smelled like pine needles and something else, something wild and clean, that reminded him of mornings when the world was still young. Eli set the pup down gently beside a large boulder, meaning to say his goodbyes and continue home alone. "You stay here now," he said softly, his voice rusty from disuse. "I can't, this ain't something I can do." He turned and walked away, forcing himself not to look back. His boots crunched in the fresh snow, each step taking him further from a responsibility he wasn't ready to shoulder. The wind picked up, sending swirls of powder dancing between the trees, and he pulled his collar higher against the cold. Behind him, a small cry rose above the wind, then another, then a sound that went through him like a blade, a keening, desperate wail that spoke of abandonment and terror and the kind of loneliness that could hollow out a soul. Eli stopped as if he'd hit a wall. The sound continued, growing weaker but no less heartbreaking, and suddenly he was 35 again, standing beside a hospital bed where Sarah lay small and fragile against white sheets. Her voice had been barely a whisper by then, but her words had carried the weight of a lifetime. "Promise me you won't give up on love, Eli. Promise me you'll find something to care for when I'm gone." He'd promised, of course, would have promised her anything in those final days. But he'd broken that promise almost before the dirt settled on her grave, choosing isolation over the risk of more loss. He'd told himself it was wisdom, this careful withdrawal from anything that might matter. Now, listening to the pup's cries grow weaker in the cold night air, he recognized it for what it had really been: cowardice. His wedding ring caught on his glove as he wiped snow from his eyes. Sarah had been barely 22 when she'd slipped it onto his finger, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what they were promising each other. She'd believed in him then, believed in his capacity for tenderness, even when he couldn't see it himself. She'd spent 33 years drawing that gentleness out of him, teaching him that strength and softness weren't opposites, but dance partners in the waltz of a life well lived. The crying stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. Eli turned around and stumbled back through the snow, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird. What if he was too late? What if his moment of weakness had cost this small life the only chance it had? He found the pup curled into a tight ball beside the boulder, so still that panic seized his throat. But when he knelt and reached out with trembling fingers, he felt the quick flutter of breathing, the tiny heart still beating against ribs no thicker than pencils. The little creature was unconscious, overwhelmed by cold and abandonment, but alive. "I'm sorry," Eli whispered, gathering the pup close to his chest again. "I'm so damn sorry. That wasn't right, leaving you like that. You don't deserve to be left behind." The words seemed to come from someplace deeper than conscious thought, carried on a current of memory and regret that had been dammed up for 15 years. He'd left too many things behind, not just Sarah, though losing her had been the deepest cut, but pieces of himself, parts of his heart he'd thought were safer locked away than risked on new attachments. As he climbed toward home, with the pup tucked safely against his warmth, memories flooded back with startling clarity. Sarah gardening in the early morning light, her hands dark with soil as she coaxed life from seeds. Sarah singing while she cooked, her voice weaving through their small house like thread through cloth. Sarah reading in bed beside him, her finger tracing lines of poetry she'd share, when something particularly beautiful caught her attention. But it wasn't just the good memories that came flooding back. He remembered the fights, too, the stubborn arguments about money and priorities and dreams that seemed too big for their small corner of the world. He remembered the long silences that sometimes stretched between them when work was hard and bills were tight. He remembered the disappointment in her eyes when the doctor told them children weren't likely, and the way they'd both learned to carry that particular grief without letting it poison what they had. It had been real, their love messy and complicated, and shot through with all the ordinary struggles that marked any long marriage. But it had also been extraordinary in its daily persistence, the way they'd chosen each other again and again through seasons of plenty and seasons of want. Sarah had taught him that love wasn't a feeling you fell into and out of, but a decision you made every morning when you opened your eyes to face another day. The pup stirred against his chest, making small sounds that might have been dreams or might have been memories of its mother's warmth. Eli adjusted his grip, making sure the little creature was secure, and picked up his pace. The cabin wasn't far now. Maybe another mile through timber, he knew, as well as his own reflection. He had milk powder from his monthly supply run to town, and there was an old baby bottle somewhere in the back of a cupboard, a remnant from the brief time he and Sarah had dared to hope. Snow was accumulating on the trail now, erasing his earlier tracks and transforming the familiar landscape into something soft and new. The storm was settling in for the night, the kind of heavy snowfall that could dump 2 feet before morning and lock the mountain in winter's embrace until spring. It would be a hard season for all the wild creatures, but especially hard for anything young or weak or alone. The realization hit him with sudden force. He was no longer alone. This small, wild thing, depending on his warmth, had changed something fundamental in the careful structure of his solitude. For the first time in 15 years, someone needed him. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. When his cabin finally came into view through the falling snow, golden light spilling from its windows like a promise of shelter and safety, Eli felt something he'd almost forgotten was possible. Not happiness, exactly that seemed too much to hope for just yet, but something lighter than the resigned contentment that had carried him through the long years of grief, something that felt suspiciously like hope. The pup opened its eyes as they reached the cabin steps, those blue eyes reflecting the lamplight like small stars. It didn't cry or struggle, just looked around with the kind of alert curiosity that spoke of intelligence and adaptability. Maybe this could work. Maybe, against all reasonable expectation, they could figure out how to need each other without breaking each other's hearts. Eli paused at his door, one hand on the latch, the other cradling this unexpected gift the mountain had given him. Beyond the windows, he could see the warm glow of the fire he'd banked before his evening walk, the simple furniture that had served him well through seasons of solitude. It was still his sanctuary, his refuge from a world that had proven capable of such profound loss. But now, it was something more, a place where new kinds of love might be possible if he had the courage to try again. Inside the cabin's warmth, Eli's hands shook as he tried to coax milk from the old baby bottle he'd found, buried behind mason jars and forgotten preserves. The bottle had been Sarah's idea, purchased during one of their hopeful phases when they'd still believed children might come. Now, 15 years later, it would serve a purpose neither of them could have imagined. The pup he'd started thinking of it as Ghost for its pale grey coat and the way it had appeared like a spirit in the gathering dusk lay curled in the hand-carved wooden bowl Sarah had made during their second winter together. She'd spent weeks shaping it from a piece of white pine, sanding it smooth with infinite patience until it felt like silk under the fingers. Eli had eaten countless meals from that bowl, but seeing the small wolf nestled in it felt right somehow, as if Sarah had known all along what it would be needed for. Ghost's breathing was steady now, no longer the quick, panicked puffs of earlier. The warmth of the cabin and the security of being enclosed seemed to have calmed him, though his blue eyes remained alert, tracking Eli's movements with an intelligence that seemed remarkable for such a young creature. When Eli approached with the bottle, Ghost lifted his head but showed no fear, only curiosity. "Easy now," Eli murmured, his voice softer than it had been in years. "Let's see if we can get some food into you." The first few attempts were clumsy disasters. Ghost didn't understand the bottle, kept pouring at it and trying to nurse from Eli's fingers instead. Milk spilled onto the pine floor, and Eli found himself apologizing to the small creature as if it might understand his embarrassment. But gradually, with patience that surprised him, they worked it out together. Ghost figured out the bottle, and Eli learned how to hold it at the right angle, how to read the pup's signals for more or enough. "There you go," he said, as Ghost finally got the hang of it, small tail wagging for the first time since Eli had found him. "You're a smart one, aren't you? Just needed to figure out how things work in this strange new world." The words came easier than he'd expected. He'd grown so accustomed to silence that he'd forgotten the simple pleasure of talking to another living thing. Not that Ghost understood the words, but he seemed to understand the tone, the gentle cadence that spoke of safety and care. When the bottle was empty, Ghost curled back into the wooden bowl and promptly fell asleep. Eli sat, watching him for a long time, struck by how small and vulnerable the pup looked despite the wildness that already showed in the set of his ears, the length of his legs. This wasn't a dog, wasn't meant to be tame, but for now, for these first crucial weeks or months, they were partners in survival. The storm raged outside, wind howling around the cabin's eaves and rattling the windows. Eli had weathered hundreds of such nights alone, content with his books and his solitary routines. Tonight felt different. Every few minutes he found himself checking on Ghost, making sure the pup was still breathing, still warm, still safely contained in Sarah's bowl. The fire needed tending, so he added another log and adjusted the damper to burn steady through the night. The routine was comforting the same tasks he'd performed thousands of times before, but now, with the awareness that he wasn't just keeping himself warm. Another life depended on these small acts of preparation and care. As he settled into his reading chair with a cup of coffee, Ghost stirred and opened his eyes. The pup looked around the cabin with growing alertness, taking in the rough log walls, the stone fireplace, the simple furniture that made up Eli's world. When their eyes met, Ghost didn't look away but held his gaze with that unnerving directness that seemed to see straight through to whatever was left of Eli's carefully guarded heart. "What are you thinking about, little one?" Eli asked softly. "Wondering what kind of fool human you've gotten tangled up with?" Ghost tilted his head at the sound of Eli's voice, ears pricking forward with interest. Then, to Eli's amazement, the pup tried to stand on unsteady legs, wobbled for a moment, and managed to climb out of the wooden bowl. He was larger than he'd seemed when curled up, already showing the long legs and large paws that promised significant growth in the months ahead. But instead of exploring the cabin or seeking escape, Ghost padded directly to Eli's chair and sat down beside it, looking up expectantly. It was such a simple gesture, but it hit Eli with unexpected force. This wild creature, who should by all rights be afraid of humans, was choosing companionship over solitude. "Well," Eli said, reaching down to gently stroke the soft fur between Ghost's ears, "I suppose, if you're going to stay close, I should get used to the company." Ghost leaned into the touch, a small rumble that might have been a purr or might have been contentment vibrating in his chest. Eli had forgotten how good it felt to offer comfort to another living thing, to have that comfort accepted and returned. His hand found a rhythm, gentle strokes that seemed to soothe them both. The night stretched on, snow still falling steadily outside, and Eli found himself talking more than he had in years. He told Ghost about the cabin, pointing out the various corners and explaining their purposes. The kitchen area, with its simple stove and handmade cabinets. The sleeping alcove with its narrow bed and wool blankets. The workshop corner, where he repaired tools and worked leather. "That bookshelf there," he said, indicating the rough pine shelves lined with worn volumes. "Those were mostly Sarah's. She loved stories about places she'd never been, people she'd never meet. Used to read to me sometimes in the evenings, especially during the hard winters when we were snowed in for weeks at a time." Ghost listened with the focused attention of someone trying to learn a new language, his blue eyes following Eli's gestures and his ears swiveling to catch every nuance of tone. It was probably just instinct. Eli knew young animals learning to read their caregivers for signs of threat or safety. But it felt like more than that. Felt like genuine interest in the stories and memories Eli was sharing. When exhaustion finally began to claim them both, Eli faced a new dilemma. Where should Ghost sleep? The wooden bowl had served for a few hours, but the pup was already too big to be comfortable there all night. And after the trauma of losing his mother, being alone might trigger more distress. The solution, when it came to him, felt as natural as breathing. Eli arranged some old blankets beside his bed, creating a nest that would keep Ghost warm and close enough for reassurance. As he settled under his own covers, he heard the soft sound of paws on pine boards, then felt the slight depression of the mattress as Ghost somehow managed to climb up onto the bed. The pup curled against Eli's side with a contented sigh, small body radiating warmth and trust. For a moment, Eli considered moving him back to the blankets on the floor, but the weight and warmth felt too good, too much like the companionship he'd forgotten he missed. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain, but inside the small cabin, two unlikely souls had found shelter in each other. The second week brought changes that surprised Eli with their swiftness. Ghost had grown noticeably, his legs longer and his coat thickening against the mountain cold. More importantly, his personality was emerging, playful, intelligent, and possessed of a curiosity that kept Eli constantly alert. The pup investigated every corner of the cabin, nosing into corners and cupboards, learning the scents and textures of his new world with methodical thoroughness. Eli found himself adjusting his routines in ways both small and significant. Morning chores now included preparing Ghost's milk and taking him outside for his needs, activities that broke the solitary rhythm he'd maintained for 15 years. The pup seemed to understand the basic requirements of den cleanliness, seeking the door when nature called and returning promptly to the warmth inside. It was during one of these morning outings that Eli realized how dramatically his perspective had shifted. Instead of seeing the forest as a place of peaceful isolation, he now viewed it through protective eyes, scanning for threats that might harm a vulnerable young wolf. The eagles that circled overhead were no longer just part of the mountain's beauty, but potential predators. The coyote tracks in the snow near his woodpile were no longer just evidence of wildlife passing through, but signs of danger to be monitored. "You're turning me into something I haven't been in a long time," he told Ghost, as they stood on the cabin's small porch, watching snow fall through the pine boughs. "A warrior." Ghost looked up at him with those remarkably blue eyes, tail wagging slightly at the familiar sound of Eli's voice. The pup had learned to associate that gentle tone with safety and care, and he responded to it with the eager attention of a student learning from a beloved teacher. Back inside, Eli reached into the cedar chest at the foot of his bed and pulled out something he hadn't touched in years: Sarah's knitted blanket, the one she'd worked on during their final winter together. It was pale blue wool, soft as clouds, with an intricate pattern that had kept her fingers busy during the long hours when pain made sleep impossible. He'd wrapped it around his shoulders on the worst nights after she was gone, but eventually even that comfort had become too painful to bear. Now he spread it carefully on the floor near the fireplace, creating a proper bed for Ghost. The pup approached cautiously, nose working to process this new scent that carried mysterious associations. When he finally settled onto the blanket, something tight in Eli's chest loosened. Sarah would have loved this, seeing her final gift, used to comfort another creature who needed warmth and care. She made that for someone she loved, he told Ghost, who was already kneading the soft wool with his paws in the way young animals seek comfort. Reckon that includes you now. The days established their own rhythm. Feeding times became opportunities for play, as well as nourishment. Ghost had learned to associate the sound of Eli preparing the bottle with good things coming, and he would dance around Eli's feet with barely contained excitement. After eating, he often fell into a milk-drunk sleep that reminded Eli of the barn cats from his childhood, completely relaxed and trusting. But it was the evenings that revealed the depth of change occurring in both of them. Ghost had developed the habit of sitting beside Eli's reading chair, sometimes resting his head on Eli's boot, sometimes content just to be close while Eli read aloud. The practice had started accidentally, Eli commenting on passages that caught his attention, but Ghost's obvious enjoyment of the sound had turned it into a nightly ritual. "Listen to this," Eli said one evening, reading from a collection of Robert Service poems Sarah had loved. "There are strange things done in the midnight sun by the men who moil for gold. You'd like Service, I think. He understood about wild places and the folks who choose to live in them." Ghost's ears perked forward, following the cadence of the verse with apparent interest. Whether he understood any of it was irrelevant. What mattered was the connection, the sense of sharing something meaningful with another consciousness. It was during these quiet hours that memories of Sarah surfaced most clearly. Eli found himself telling Ghost about her in ways he'd never been able to articulate before, even to himself. How she'd sung while she worked, her voice weaving through their small house like thread through fabric. How she'd had names for all the birds that visited their feeder, elaborate personalities she'd assigned to the regular customers. How she'd cried the first time she saw a newborn calf take its first wobbly steps, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming beauty of life beginning. She wanted children, he told Ghost one night, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "We tried for years, went to doctors, tried everything they suggested. Never happened for us." She said maybe it wasn't meant to be, maybe we were supposed to love in different ways. Ghost had grown increasingly responsive to the emotional undertones in Eli's voice. When sadness crept into the stories, the pup would move closer, sometimes resting his chin on Eli's knee in a gesture of comfort so natural it seemed instinctive. These moments of wordless understanding were becoming precious to Eli, evidence of a bond forming that went beyond simple caretaking. The physical demands of caring for a growing wolf pup were considerable. Ghost needed more frequent feeding now, and his play had become more energetic. He'd discovered the joy of tug-of-war with old rope, and his needle-sharp teeth left marks on everything he could reach. Eli found himself puppy-proofing the cabin, moving valuable or dangerous items out of reach, and accepting that some things would simply become casualties of Ghost's exploration. But there were rewards that surprised him daily. The way Ghost greeted him each morning, as if his return from the outhouse was the best thing that had happened in weeks. The soft sounds of contentment Ghost made when settling down for sleep. The moments when those blue eyes looked at him with such obvious affection that Eli felt his carefully constructed emotional walls crumbling a little more each day. One evening, as they sat by the fire with Ghost sprawled contentedly on Sarah's blanket, Eli realized he was no longer counting the days until the pup would be old enough to return to the wild. Instead, he was learning to live in the present moment, to appreciate the daily discoveries and small triumphs that marked Ghost's growth and their growing bond. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. Love, he was remembering, was always a risk. But it was also, perhaps, the only thing that made the risk of living worthwhile. Outside, the mountain winter was settling in with its familiar harshness, but inside the small cabin, something warmer than fire was taking hold and growing stronger with each passing day. Winter settled over the Bitterroot Range with the finality of a door closing. By the third week of November, snow lay 3 feet deep around the cabin, and the thermometer outside Eli's window rarely climbed above 0 during the day. The world had contracted to the circle of warmth around his fireplace, and for the first time in 15 years, Eli found himself grateful for the enforced intimacy of the season. Ghost had grown considerably, his puppy softness giving way to the lean muscle of an adolescent wolf. His coat had thickened to protect against the cold, and his paws seemed too large for his body, promising the impressive size he would eventually reach. But it was the intelligence in those blue eyes that struck Eli most forcefully, an awareness that seemed to grow sharper each day, as if Ghost was not just learning about his environment, but truly understanding it. The old trapping snare hanging on the cabin wall had become an unexpected teacher. Eli had kept it there as a reminder of skills he'd once needed to survive, back in the days when he'd supplemented their ranch income with fur trapping during the lean winter months. Now, as he explained its workings to Ghost during one of their long evenings by the fire, he found himself thinking about different kinds of traps, the ones people set for themselves without realizing it. Here's what they call a deadfall, he said, handling the rusted steel with the respect due to any tool that had once meant the difference between eating and going hungry. Simple enough animal steps on the trigger, weight comes down, and that's the end of it. Quick and clean, if you set it right. Ghost watched with fascination as Eli demonstrated the mechanism, his ears following every movement of Eli's hands. The pup had developed an intense interest in anything that captured Eli's attention, as if recognizing that learning from his human was essential to survival. But see, the thing about traps, Eli continued, settling back into his chair, is that sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. You spend so much time thinking about how to catch other things, you forget to watch for what might be catching you. He'd been caught, he realized now, caught by grief 15 years ago, and held fast ever since. He'd set his own trap with such skill that escape had seemed impossible. Isolation had been both the snare and the bait, promising safety while delivering a different kind of death. Only now, with Ghost's warm presence filling the spaces between his words, could he see how completely he'd been ensnared. The blizzard that struck during Thanksgiving week lasted 3 days and nights, piling snow halfway up the cabin windows and turning the world into a white wilderness that stretched unbroken to the horizon. For 72 hours, they were completely cut off from everything beyond their small sanctuary, dependent entirely on each other for company and comfort. It was during this storm that their bond deepened into something Eli hadn't expected. Ghost seemed to sense the gravity of their situation, the way the wind shook the cabin's walls, the strange quality of light that filtered through snow-covered windows, the subtle tension in Eli's movements as he carefully rationed firewood and checked their supplies. Instead of becoming restless or anxious, Ghost stayed close, as if understanding that they were partners in weathering this trial. He followed Eli through his careful preparations, watching as the older man arranged their remaining food, tested the integrity of the roof under its burden of snow, and adjusted the fire to burn as efficiently as possible. Good boy, Eli murmured as Ghost settled beside him during the worst of the storm, the wind howling like all the lonely souls that had ever been lost in winter mountains. "We're going to be fine. Got plenty of wood, enough food for a week if we're careful, and each other for company. That's more than I've had in a long time." It was true. The enforced closeness, which should have felt oppressive after years of solitude, instead brought a sense of rightness that surprised him. Ghost's presence transformed the cabin from a refuge from the world into something warmer, a real home where two creatures cared for each other's welfare. On the second night of the storm, with the fire burning low and the wind reaching a crescendo that made conversation impossible, Ghost did something that stopped Eli's breath. The young wolf threw back his head and howled, not the puppy whimpers Eli had grown accustomed to, but a true wolf song that seemed to contain all the wildness and beauty of the mountains themselves. The sound pierced through the storm's fury, carrying notes of longing and belonging that resonated in Eli's chest like struck steel. It was the first time Ghost had truly revealed his wolf nature, and instead of fear or concern about what it might mean for their future together, Eli felt a profound sense of privilege. This magnificent creature, who could have died alone in the cold, was sharing his deepest nature in the warmth of their shelter. When the howl faded, Ghost looked at Eli with an expression that seemed almost apologetic, as if unsure whether his wild voice was welcome in this human space. But Eli reached out and scratched behind the pointed ears, his own voice thick with emotion when he spoke. "That was beautiful," he said simply. "Don't you ever be ashamed of what you are. This world needs more wildness, not less." Ghost's tail wagged slowly, and he pressed closer to Eli's side. In that moment, Eli understood something fundamental had shifted between them. They weren't just caretaker and dependent anymore, or even just companions. They were family chosen, family of the kind that forms when two lonely souls recognize something essential in each other. The storm finally broke on the third morning, revealing a world transformed by snow and wind into something almost unrecognizable. Trees that had stood for decades were down, their trunks creating new paths and barriers across the familiar landscape. The cabin sat like an island in an ocean of white, connected to the outside world only by the thin line of smoke rising from its chimney. But inside, as Eli prepared their breakfast and Ghost stretched luxuriously on Sarah's blanket, the atmosphere was one of quiet celebration. They had weathered their first real test together and emerged not just intact but closer. The mountain winter, which had once been something Eli endured alone, had become something they would face as partners. For the first time since Sarah's death, Eli found himself looking forward to tomorrow instead of simply accepting it. The future, which had seemed like an empty expanse to be crossed with grim determination, now held possibilities he was only beginning to imagine. Spring came late to the mountains that year, but when it finally arrived in early May, it brought changes that both thrilled and worried Eli. Ghost was no longer a pup, but a young wolf of impressive size, standing nearly as high as Eli's waist, with paws that could cover a man's palm. His coat had lost its puppy fluffiness and taken on the sleek, dense quality of an adult wolf, and his blue eyes had deepened to an almost silver shade that caught light like polished metal. More challenging than his physical growth was Ghost's increasing independence. He still slept on Sarah's blanket by the fire, still greeted Eli each morning with obvious affection, but he had begun to explore beyond the immediate area around the cabin. At first, these excursions were brief, 15 or 20 minutes before he would return, usually carrying some trophy from his adventures. Interesting sticks, unusual rocks, or once, memorably, a very angry ground squirrel that he released unharmed in the cabin before Eli convinced him it belonged outside. Sarah's compass, which Eli now carried on every venture beyond the cabin, had become essential in ways he hadn't anticipated. Not for navigation, he knew these mountains better than most people knew their own neighborhoods, but for the sense of direction it provided in more metaphorical ways. The compass had been Sarah's during their hiking years, when they'd explored the wilderness areas together on weekends and vacations. She'd been the navigator, always knowing exactly where they were and how to get where they wanted to go. Now, watching Ghost range further from the cabin each day, Eli found himself using the compass not to find his way home, but to understand where this new relationship might be heading. Was he raising a wild animal that would eventually leave to find its own kind? Was he creating a dependency that would prevent Ghost from living the life he was meant to live? The questions had no easy answers, but they weighed on his mind during the long spring days when Ghost's absences stretched longer and longer. "You're growing up," he told Ghost one evening as they sat on the cabin's porch, watching the last light fade from the peaks around them. "Growing into what you're supposed to be. That's as it should be." Ghost looked at him with those intelligent eyes, head tilted in the way that had become familiar whenever Eli's tone carried complicated emotions. The wolf's understanding of human feelings had grown remarkably sophisticated over the months they'd lived together. He could read Eli's moods in the set of his shoulders, the rhythm of his breathing, the particular quality of silence that meant sadness rather than contentment. The encounter that changed everything happened on a Tuesday in late May, when the mountain meadows were just beginning to show their first tentative wildflowers. Eli was checking his fish traps in the creek below the cabin when he heard voices, human voices, the first he'd encountered in nearly 8 months. 2 men were making their way up the old miner's trail that passed within half a mile of Eli's home. They wore the practical clothing of experienced outdoorsmen, but there was something about their movements and conversation that made Eli instinctively cautious. He positioned himself where he could observe without being seen, grateful for the concealment offered by a stand of young aspen. "Trails fresher than I expected," one of them said. A lean man with prematurely grey hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent in harsh conditions. "Can't be more than a day or 2 old. Size suggests it's a big one," replied his companion, younger but carrying himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to dangerous work. "Maybe the same wolf that's been hitting the ranches down in the valley." Eli's blood went cold as he realized what they were discussing. Wolf tracks. Ghost's tracks, most likely, from one of his exploratory rambles. The men were hunters, and they were following his friend's trail with the focused intensity of predators closing in on prey. "Mitch Kowalski's offering 500 for the hide," the older man continued, adjusting the rifle slung across his shoulder. "Says the son of a bitch killed 3 calves last week." Bold as brass. In broad daylight. Eli knew Mitch Kowalski by reputation, a rancher in the valley below, whose hatred of predators was legendary among the local community. He'd lobbied for years to have wolves removed from the protected species list, claiming they were destroying the livelihood of honest ranchers. The irony was bitter. Ghost had never killed anything larger than a ground squirrel, and then only in play. The hunters moved on, following what they believed was a promising trail, but their presence had shattered the peaceful isolation Eli had taken for granted. The outside world, with its conflicts and prejudices and capacity for violence, had found its way into their sanctuary. For the first time since bringing Ghost home, Eli faced the possibility that their life together might not be sustainable. That evening, as Ghost returned from his daily exploration with his usual enthusiasm, Eli felt a weight in his chest that had nothing to do with his own mortality and everything to do with love. This magnificent creature, who had learned to trust humans through Eli's patient care, had no understanding of the danger that his very existence represented to some people. "We need to talk," Eli said, settling into his chair while Ghost took his customary place on the blanket nearby. "About the world beyond these mountains, and about choices we might have to make." Ghost listened, with the focused attention he always gave to Eli's serious conversations, but for once, Eli found himself struggling to find words for what needed to be said. How do you explain to a wild creature that the wildness he was born to embrace might be the very thing that makes him a target? How do you prepare someone you love for a world that might not have room for what they are? Outside, night settled over the mountains, with its familiar sounds, wind in the pines, the distant call of an owl, the soft rustle of small creatures going about their nocturnal business. It was the same wilderness symphony that had comforted Eli through 15 years of solitude. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight it carried undertones of threat and uncertainty that made him want to bar the door and pretend the outside world didn't exist. But pretending wouldn't protect Ghost from the reality of human prejudice and fear. If anything, it would make him more vulnerable when that reality inevitably intruded on their peaceful existence. The compass in Eli's pocket seemed to grow heavier as he contemplated the difficult navigation ahead, finding a path between love and wisdom, between protection and preparation, between the sanctuary they had created and the larger world that would ultimately claim them both. The bounty notice appeared nailed, too. The old pine tree at the trail junction 3 days after the hunters had passed through. Eli discovered it during his weekly trip to check the mailbox. He maintained at the end of the access road, a box that rarely held anything more interesting than supply catalogs and the occasional government notice. But tucked between a seed company flyer and his social security statement was something that made his hands shake with rage and fear. The paper was crisp and white, obviously fresh, with bold black lettering that shouted its message across the forest clearing. Reward $1,000 dead wolf, last seen Bitterroot Range vicinity. Cattle killer, dangerous to livestock and humans. Contact Mitch Kowalski Ranch for details. Shoot on sight. Below the text was a photograph that stopped Eli's breath. It wasn't Ghost, but it might as well have been a grey wolf of similar size and colouring, photographed in profile with the kind of telephoto lens hunters used to document their kills. To anyone who didn't know Ghost personally, the resemblance would be close enough to justify pulling a trigger. But it was the smaller print at the bottom that revealed the true depth of the threat. Suspected in multiple livestock attacks throughout Valley. Believed to be living with human assistance. Report any knowledge of wolf den or human accomplice immediately. Human accomplice. The words burned in Eli's mind as he folded the notice and slipped it into his coat pocket. 15 years of careful isolation, and now he was being branded as some kind of criminal for the simple act of caring for an orphaned animal. The injustice of it struck him like a physical blow, but beneath the anger was something colder and more practical, the recognition that their situation had just become genuinely dangerous. The walk back to the cabin gave him time to think, but not enough time to reach any comfortable conclusions. Ghost greeted him at the door with his usual enthusiasm, tail wagging and eyes bright with the uncomplicated joy of reunion. Looking at him now, Eli tried to see what the bounty hunters saw, a predator, a threat, a creature whose very existence posed a challenge to human dominance over the natural world. All he could see was family. "We've got trouble," he told Ghost as they settled by the evening fire. The wolf had learned to read the gravity in Eli's tone, and his ears flattened slightly with concern. "Somebody's put a price on your head, and they're not too particular about whether you've actually done anything wrong." Ghost tilted his head with that familiar expression of focused attention, as if trying to pass the meaning from Eli's words through pure force of concentration. He couldn't understand the specific threat, but he clearly sensed the distress it was causing his human companion. Eli pulled the bounty notice from his pocket and spread it on the floor between them. Ghost sniffed at the paper curiously, then looked up at Eli, with an expression that seemed to ask for explanation. How could Eli explain human nature to a creature who had never known betrayal? How could he make Ghost understand that there were people in the world who would kill him simply for being what he was born to be? "The truth is," Eli said, more to himself than to Ghost, "your mama probably wasn't shot by accident. She was likely killed by the same folks who want you dead now." The realization had been building in the back of his mind for weeks, but saying it aloud gave it a terrible finality. Ghost's mother hadn't died of natural causes or been killed by another predator. She'd been shot by ranchers or hunters who saw her as nothing more than a problem to be eliminated. Ghost himself had survived only because he'd been too young and small to be noticed, hidden in the brush while his mother died protecting him. The injustice of it made Eli's chest tight with emotions he'd thought himself too old to feel. How many generations of wolves had been lost to this same mindless prejudice? How many families destroyed by fear and ignorance masquerading as practical necessity? But anger, however righteous, wouldn't solve their immediate problem. The bounty hunters would be back, probably with more men and better equipment. Word would spread through the hunting and ranching communities that there was money to be made and a threat to be eliminated. Their peaceful sanctuary was about to become a war zone. Ghost seemed to sense the change in Eli's mood and moved closer, pressing his warm flank against the old man's leg in a gesture of comfort. It was a reversal of their usual dynamic. Instead of Eli providing reassurance to Ghost, the wolf was offering what comfort he could to his troubled human. The simple kindness of it nearly broke Eli's heart. "You don't understand what they want to do to you," Eli whispered, running his fingers through Ghost's thick coat. "You don't know that some people think your life is worth less than the price of a few head of cattle. You still believe the world is basically good because that's what I've shown you." And it was true. Through months of patient care and gentle interaction, Eli had given Ghost a completely false impression of humanity. The wolf had learned to associate human presence with food, warmth, safety, and affection. He had no concept of hunters or traps or the casual cruelty that marked so much of human interaction with the natural world. In trying to save Ghost, Eli realized he had made him profoundly vulnerable. The weight of responsibility settled on Eli's shoulders like a lead blanket. He'd spent 15 years avoiding exactly this kind of moral complexity, this awful tension between love and wisdom, between protection and preparation for a harsh reality. Sarah would have known what to do. She'd always been better at navigating the ethical minefield of caring for wild creatures. She'd understood instinctively that sometimes love meant letting go, even when holding on felt like the more compassionate choice. But Sarah wasn't here, and Eli was left to make decisions that would determine whether Ghost lived or died, whether he would grow into the magnificent predator he was meant to be, or become a victim of human fear and stupidity. The fire crackled and shifted, sending shadows dancing across the cabin walls. Ghost had relaxed somewhat, reassured by Eli's presence, even if he couldn't understand the source of the threat. His breathing had settled into the slow, regular rhythm of approaching sleep, the trust in his posture absolute and heartbreaking. Eli knew he had perhaps days, maybe a week at most, before the hunters returned with reinforcements. The trail to his cabin wasn't hard to follow for anyone with basic tracking skills, and once they found evidence of Ghost's presence here, Eli's own safety would be in question. Human accomplice wasn't just words on a piece of paper, it was a label that could justify almost any level of violence in the minds of people who saw wolves as an existential threat to their way of life. He had to make a choice, and he had to make it soon. Keep Ghost hidden, and hope the hunters moved on to other areas, risking discovery and the violent confrontation that would surely follow. Try to relocate Ghost somewhere deeper in the wilderness, away from human contact, but also away from the only family the wolf had ever known. Or face the hardest option of all, prepare for a fight he wasn't sure he could win, but knew he couldn't avoid. Outside, the mountain night settled into its familiar rhythms, but Eli found no comfort in the sounds that had soothed him through 15 years of solitude. Tonight, every snap of a branch might be a hunter moving through the darkness. Every distant sound might be the approach of men who had reduced Ghost's magnificent wildness to a dollar figure on a piece of paper. For the first time since bringing Ghost home, Eli began to plan for war. Eli's old rifle hadn't been fired in anger for more than 20 years, but his hands remembered its weight and balance as if no time had passed at all. The Winchester Model 70 had been his father's gun before it was his, carried through 2 tours in Vietnam and countless hunting seasons in the years that followed. Sarah had never liked having it in the house, but she'd understood that some tools were too important to put aside just because you hoped never to need them again. Now, as he worked a thin coat of oil into the bolt mechanism by lamplight, Eli found himself remembering the last time he'd prepared for violence. It had been during his final months in the service, when his unit was tasked with holding a firebase that everyone knew the enemy wanted badly enough to die for. He'd spent 3 days checking and rechecking his equipment, writing letters he hoped Sarah would never have to read, and trying to reconcile the man she'd married with the man he became when survival demanded it. The firebase had been overrun despite their preparations, but Eli and 7 others had held out in a bunker for 18 hours before relief arrived. He'd learned that night that loving someone could make you both braver and more afraid than you'd ever thought possible. Braver because you had something worth fighting for, more afraid because you had something irreplaceable to lose. Ghost watched these preparations with growing unease. The wolf's intelligence had grown sophisticated enough to recognize the significance of weapons being cleaned and loaded, of maps being studied, and defensive positions being planned. He couldn't understand the specific nature of the threat, but he clearly sensed that their peaceful existence was about to be shattered by forces beyond their control. "I know this is confusing," Eli said as he loaded cartridges into the rifle's magazine with the deliberate precision of someone who'd done this too many times before. "You've never seen me like this because I promised myself I'd never have to be like this again. But sometimes the world doesn't give you a choice." The cabin itself would be impossible to defend against determined attackers, but Eli had other advantages. He knew every trail, every rock formation, every hiding place within 5 miles of his home. He'd spent 15 years learning to read the mountain's moods, understanding how weather and season affected visibility and movement. The hunters might have numbers and modern equipment, but he had the kind of intimate knowledge that could only come from years of patient observation. More importantly, he was no longer fighting just for himself. The old Eli might have simply retreated deeper into the wilderness, avoiding confrontation through strategic withdrawal. But that option disappeared the moment he'd taken responsibility for Ghost's welfare. Running would only delay the inevitable while putting them both at greater disadvantage. Better to choose the time and place of the confrontation while he still had some control over the circumstances. The tactical situation was complex, but not hopeless. The hunters would most likely approach along the main trail, following the path of least resistance toward the cabin. But there were 3 other routes that could bring them within rifle range, and Eli would need to cover all of them if he wanted to avoid being outflanked. The old deer blind he'd built years ago commanded a view of the most likely approaches, but it would also leave him exposed to attack from behind. Sarah's locket lay cool against his chest as he studied the hand-drawn map spread across his kitchen table. She'd given it to him before his second deployment, a small silver heart that held her photograph and a lock of her hair. He'd carried it through months of jungle fighting, touching it for luck when the mortars fell and the night filled with tracers and the screams of wounded men. It had brought him home to her twice, and now he found himself hoping it might do so again. But this time, the stakes were different. This time, he wasn't fighting to survive long enough to return to the woman he loved. He was fighting to protect a creature who depended on him completely, who had no understanding of the hatred that was marching up the mountain toward them with rifles and radios, and the absolute certainty that they were doing righteous work. The irony wasn't lost on him. 15 years ago, he'd retreated to these mountains to escape the complexity of human relationships, the messy emotional entanglements that made loss so devastating. Now he found himself preparing for battle, to protect a bond that had become more precious than his own safety. Ghost had given him back something he'd thought was lost forever, the capacity to love without reservation, to put another's welfare before his own survival instinct. Ghost's behavior over the next 2 days confirmed Eli's growing suspicions about the timeline they were working with. The wolf had become increasingly agitated, spending long periods staring down the mountain toward the valleys below. His acute hearing and sophisticated scent detection were picking up signs of human activity that Eli's duller senses couldn't register. The way Ghost's ears swiveled and his nostrils flared suggested that multiple people were moving through the lower elevations, probably establishing a base camp before beginning their systematic search of the area. "How many, do you think?" Eli asked during one of these surveillance sessions, though he knew Ghost couldn't answer in words. But the wolf's body language was eloquent, the tense set of his shoulders, the constant shifting between alert watchfulness and barely contained impulse to flee. Whatever Ghost was sensing, it was significant enough to trigger every survival instinct he possessed. The waiting was the hardest part. Eli had always been a man of action, more comfortable with difficult work than with the uncertainty that preceded it. During his ranching years, he'd faced droughts and market crashes and the thousand small crises that could destroy a year's work in a matter of days. But those challenges had been straightforward problems that could be solved through hard work, careful planning, and stubborn persistence. This was different. This was about the collision between two worldviews that had no common ground for negotiation. To Mitch Kowalski and his allies, Ghost was a predator that threatened their livelihood and way of life. To Eli, Ghost was family, a connection to the natural world that had restored his faith in the possibility of love after loss. There was no compromise position between those perspectives, no middle ground where both sides could claim partial victory. As darkness fell on what Eli suspected would be their last quiet evening together, he found himself cataloguing memories with the intensity of someone who understood their irreplaceable value. Ghost's first tentative steps across the cabin floor. The night he'd learned to drink from the bottle. The morning he'd brought Eli a pine cone as a gift, tail wagging with pride at his contribution to their shared life. The way he'd curl against Eli's side during thunderstorms, offering and receiving comfort in equal measure. "Whatever happens tomorrow or the next day," he told Ghost as they sat by the fire that had warmed so many peaceful evenings, "I want you to know that you saved my life just as much as I saved yours. Maybe more." Ghost looked at him with those silver eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding that simple animal intelligence couldn't explain. Sometimes Eli wondered if wolves carried some form of ancestral memory, an inherited wisdom that connected them to thousands of generations of their kind. If so, Ghost might understand better than Eli did what was coming and what it would cost them both. The rifle leaned against the wall near the door, loaded and ready. Extra ammunition sat in neat rows on the kitchen table, along with a first aid kit and supplies for a possible retreat deeper into the mountains. Eli had done everything he could to prepare for the confrontation he couldn't avoid, but he knew that all the planning in the world might not be enough against determined men with superior numbers and modern equipment. What he had was love, knowledge of the terrain, and the kind of desperate courage that came from having nothing left to lose except the thing that mattered most. It would have to be enough, because it was all he had to offer. Tomorrow or the next day, when the hunters finally came for Ghost, they would discover that some old soldiers never forgot how to fight, and that the fiercest battles were always fought not for abstract principles, but for the people or creatures who made life worth living. Outside, the mountain night held its breath, waiting for dawn and the final test of everything Eli had learned about love, loss, and the terrible choices that defined a man's character when all the safe options had been stripped away. They came at dawn, just as Eli had expected. 3 men moving up the main trail with the confident stride of hunters who believed they held every advantage. Through his binoculars, positioned in the old deer blind he'd reinforced during the night, Eli could see their faces clearly enough to read their intentions. These weren't casual bounty hunters looking for easy money. They moved with the disciplined coordination of men accustomed to dangerous work. The leader was the older hunter he'd observed days earlier, the one with prematurely grey hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. Behind him came two younger men, both carrying high-powered rifles with expensive scopes. They wore military surplus clothing and moved with the kind of tactical awareness that suggested professional training. Eli's heart sank as he recognized the signs. These weren't just ranchers protecting their livestock. These were men who killed for a living. Ghost sensed the approaching danger with the heightened awareness of a creature whose ancestors had survived by reading subtle changes in the environment. He'd been restless all night, pacing the cabin and whining softly whenever Eli moved toward the windows. Now, crouched beside Eli in the deer blind, his entire body was coiled with tension, every muscle ready for flight or fight. "Stay quiet," Eli whispered, one hand resting gently on Ghost's neck. "Let me see what they want first. Maybe we can talk our way through this." But even as he said it, Eli knew the hope was futile. The way the men spread out as they approached the cabin, the careful way they checked their weapons and coordinated their movements, these were the actions of people who had already decided how this encounter would end. They weren't here to negotiate or issue warnings. They were here to collect a bounty. The leader called out when they reached the small clearing in front of the cabin, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Eli Cutter, we know you're up there. We just want to talk." Eli almost smiled at the transparency of the lie. If they just wanted to talk, they wouldn't have brought enough firepower to stop a charging grizzly. If they just wanted to talk, they would have approached openly, instead of using military tactics to establish fields of fire around his home. "I'm listening," Eli called back, not revealing his position, but letting them know he was aware of their presence. "What do you want to talk about?" "About the wolf you're harboring," the leader responded. "About the livestock it's been killing, about the bounty that's going to be collected one way or another." Ghost's ears flattened at the hostile tone, and Eli felt the wolf's muscles bunch beneath his touch. Even without understanding the words, Ghost could read the aggression in the human voices, the threat that vibrated through every syllable. His lips pulled back slightly, revealing the impressive canines that marked him as a predator despite months of domestic tranquility. "What wolf?" Eli called, buying time while he assessed their positions and planned his next move. "Haven't seen any wolves up here in years." The leader's laugh was harsh and without humor. "Don't play games with us, old man. We've been tracking it for weeks. We know it's here, and we know you've been feeding it. That makes you an accomplice to every calf it's killed." The accusation hung in the air between them like a challenge. Eli knew there was no point in continued denials. They had obviously found enough evidence to convince themselves of Ghost's presence. The question now was whether he could convince them to leave without violence, or whether this confrontation would end the way his military instincts told him it would. "Even if there was a wolf here," Eli said, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority he'd learned to project under fire, "it hasn't killed any calves. Check your facts before you start throwing accusations around." "Facts?" The leader's voice rose with indignation. "The fact is that 3 ranches in the valley have lost cattle in the past month. The fact is that wolf tracks lead straight up this mountain. The fact is that you've been living up here like some kind of hermit, probably going crazy from the isolation." One of the younger hunters had moved to flank the cabin from the left, while his partner took position near the woodpile on the right. They were establishing a kill zone. Eli realized a triangular field of fire that would make escape impossible once the shooting started. These men had done this before, probably more than once. Sarah's locket felt warm against his chest as he made the decision that would determine whether he and Ghost lived or died in the next few minutes. There would be no peaceful resolution to this confrontation. The hunters had come here to kill Ghost and collect their bounty, and they wouldn't leave empty-handed. If Eli wanted to save the wolf who had become his family, he would have to fight for him. "Last chance, old man," the leader called. "Send the wolf out and we'll make it quick. Keep protecting it, and things are going to get ugly for both of you." Eli's finger found the rifle's trigger as he whispered a prayer Sarah had taught him years ago, a simple request for the strength to do what was right, even when the cost was high. Ghost pressed closer to his side, as if sensing that their peaceful life together was about to end in violence and uncertainty. "I'm sorry," Eli whispered to the wolf who had trusted him completely. "I'm sorry, it has to be this way." The first shot came without warning, splintering the wood frame of Eli's deer blind and sending Ghost into a crouch that spoke of generations of survival instinct. Eli didn't return fire immediately. Years of military training had taught him the value of letting an enemy reveal their positions before committing to engagement. The shot had come from the hunter positioned near the woodpile, a hasty attempt to flush them from cover rather than a carefully aimed kill shot. "That's enough talk," the leader shouted. "Take them both down!" But Eli was no longer where they expected him to be. While the hunters had been focused on the deer blind, he and Ghost had slipped out the back and moved to a position among the rocks above the cabin. The small stone cairn he'd built over Ghost's mother's remains sat 20 yards to their left, a memorial that would now become the site of their final stand. Ghost seemed to understand that stealth was no longer an option. His hackles rose and his lips pulled back in a silent snarl that transformed him from domestic companion into the apex predator he'd been born to be. The months of gentle nurturing hadn't erased his wolf nature, they'd simply given him something precious to defend. Eli's first shot took the hunter near the woodpile in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering across the rocky ground. The man's cry of pain and surprise echoed off the mountain peaks, followed immediately by return fire from his two companions. Bullets whined off the granite outcropping where Eli and Ghost had taken shelter, sending chips of stone flying like shrapnel. "You're only making this harder on yourself," the leader called, his voice tight with anger now rather than false concern. "That wolf is going to die today. Question is whether you die with it." Eli worked the bolt on his rifle with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd done it under pressure countless times before. The familiar weight and balance of the weapon felt like greeting an old friend, a reliable companion in a world that had suddenly become very dangerous. Sarah's locket pressed against his chest as he shifted position, and he could almost hear her voice, urging him to be smart, to be careful, to come home to her in one piece. But there would be no going home from this fight. Win or lose, their quiet life together was over. The best he could hope for was to save Ghost's life and give him a chance to disappear into the deep wilderness where human hatred couldn't reach him. The second hunter had worked his way around to the right, trying to get a clear shot from behind the cabin. Eli caught the movement in his peripheral vision and swung his rifle toward the new threat. But Ghost was faster. The wolf burst from cover with a speed that took everyone by surprise, covering the distance to the hunter in 3 powerful bounds. The man's scream as Ghost knocked him down was cut short by the crack of Eli's rifle as he put a bullet into the tree, inches from the hunter's head, close enough to convince him that resistance would be fatal, but not close enough to actually kill him. Ghost stood over the fallen man, every muscle coiled for violence, but he didn't attack. Months of gentle treatment had taught him that humans could be reasoned with, could be warned rather than destroyed. "Call him off!" The wounded hunter near the woodpile was shouting, cradling his shattered shoulder. "Call him off before he kills Tom." But the leader was beyond listening to pleas for mercy. He'd worked his way to within 50 yards of Eli's position, close enough for a clear shot, despite the cover of the rocks. When he raised his rifle toward Ghost, Eli saw murder in his eyes, not just the practical killing of a bounty target, but the passionate hatred of someone who viewed wolves as personal enemies. "No," Eli shouted, rising from cover to draw the man's fire toward himself instead of Ghost. "You want to fight? Fight me!" The leader's rifle swung toward Eli, and for a moment that seemed to stretch across eternity, the two men faced each other across the small clearing where Ghost's mother had been buried with such care and reverence. Here, where their journey together had begun with loss and tenderness, it would end with violence and the kind of courage that came from loving something more than your own survival. Sarah's locket caught the morning sunlight as Eli took careful aim, his breathing steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. He thought of the promises he'd made and broken, the love he'd lost and found again, the simple miracle of trust that had brought a wild creature into his heart despite all his careful defenses against caring. Ghost, sensing the climactic nature of the moment, threw back his head and howled not in fear or pain, but with the ancient song of his people, the wild music that had echoed through these mountains long before humans came, with their rifles and their hatred and their inability to see beauty in anything they couldn't control. The sound seemed to hang in the thin mountain air like a prayer, like a challenge, like a declaration that some bonds were stronger than the violence that sought to break them. The standoff lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt like hours to Eli. The lead hunter's rifle was trained on his chest, while Eli's own weapon was aimed steadily at the man's center mass. Ghost stood between them, no longer the helpless pup Eli had carried home through the snow, but a magnificent wolf in his prime, silver eyes reflecting the morning sunlight like polished metal. "You're going to die for a wolf," the hunter said, his voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and contempt. "A goddamn wolf that's been killing cattle and terrorizing honest ranchers. He's never killed anything but rabbits and ground squirrels," Eli replied calmly, his finger steady on the trigger. "And you killed his mother for the same lies you're telling about him." Something in Eli's tone must have carried conviction, because the hunter's eyes flickered with uncertainty for the first time since the confrontation began. But his rifle remained steady, and Eli knew that doubt alone wouldn't be enough to prevent bloodshed. These men had come too far and invested too much in their version of the truth to back down now. It was Ghost who broke the stalemate, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of attacking or retreating, the wolf padded slowly to the stone cairn that marked his mother's grave and lay down beside it, resting his chin on the carefully arranged stones. His posture was one of profound sadness rather than aggression, a son mourning at his mother's resting place, seeking comfort in the only connection that remained to the family he'd lost. The simple dignity of the gesture was so powerful that even the hunters fell silent. Here was no slavering beast or cattle-killing predator, but a creature capable of grief, of loyalty, of the kind of complex emotions that humans preferred to believe belonged only to themselves. Ghost's mourning was as real and heartbreaking as any human's, and in that moment it became impossible to see him as anything other than what he truly was, a wild soul trying to find his place in a world that had taken everything from him except the love of one old man. The hunter with the wounded shoulder spoke first, his voice subdued by what they'd all witnessed. "Jesus, Mitch was wrong about this one. Look at him. That's not a killer, that's a dog with a broken heart." The leader's rifle wavered, doubt finally overcoming conviction. "But the cattle, someone's been hitting the ranches." "Someone else," Eli said quietly. "This wolf has never been off this mountain, never been anywhere near your valley or your cattle. You've been chasing shadows while the real killer runs free." It was true, and some part of the hunter seemed to recognize the truth in Eli's words. Ghost's behavior, his obvious domestication, his gentle response even to threat and violence, none of it matched the profile of a livestock killer. The real predator they sought was still out there, probably watching this confrontation with amusement from the safety of deeper wilderness. Slowly, reluctantly, the leader lowered his rifle. "If we're wrong about this," he said, "if he's not the one we're looking for, then you'd better start looking elsewhere." Eli finished. "Before you kill an innocent animal and let the real problem escape." The tension drained out of the clearing like water from a broken dam. The hunter near the cabin emerged from behind the building, keeping his hands visible and his movements slow. His companion with the wounded shoulder struggled to his feet, cradling his arm but no longer reaching for his weapon. The immediate threat was over, but Eli knew their troubles were far from finished. "This doesn't end the bounty," the leader said, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Kowalski still wants a wolf dead, and he's not particular about which one." "Then you'd better find the right one," Eli replied. "Because this one's under my protection, and I've got more experience with violence than you might expect." There was something in his tone, the flat certainty of someone who'd faced death before and would do so again if necessary, that convinced the hunters he wasn't bluffing. They withdrew without further confrontation, helping their wounded companion down the mountain and leaving Eli and Ghost alone in their sanctuary once again. But everything had changed. The outside world had found them, had brought its hatred and violence into their peaceful refuge. Even though they'd survived this confrontation, others would follow. Word would spread that the wolf was still alive, still protected by the hermit on the mountain. The bounty would remain, and eventually someone would come who couldn't be reasoned with or frightened away. That evening, as they sat by their fire, for what both somehow understood would be one of the last times, Eli began carving. He'd found a piece of white pine near Ghost's mother's grave, weathered, smooth by wind and rain, but still solid enough to hold detail. With his pocket knife, he began shaping it into a small wolf figure, not perfect, but recognizable, something that would serve as a memorial to their time together. "I'm going to have to let you go," he told Ghost as he worked, his voice thick with emotions he'd thought himself too old to feel. "Not because I want to, but because keeping you here means watching you die, and I can't bear that again." Ghost seemed to understand, though perhaps not the specifics. He pressed close to Eli's side, offering what comfort he could to the human who had saved him and loved him and would now sacrifice his own happiness to ensure Ghost's survival. The wooden wolf took shape slowly under Eli's patient hands, each cut of the knife a prayer for safe journeys and new beginnings. When it was finished, he would place it on the mantle where the firelight would catch it each evening, a reminder of the wild soul who had taught an old man how to love again. Outside, the mountain wind sang its eternal song through the pine boughs, carrying the promise of seasons yet to come and the certainty that some bonds, once forged in love and tested by hardship, could never truly be broken. Tomorrow would bring difficult goodbyes and the return to solitude, but tonight they had each other and the warmth of the fire and the knowledge that love, however brief, was always worth the pain of its ending.